Let's bring in our panel, Fiona Scott and Claire March. Claire, first to you, a real milestone today, isn't it? The first flights coming in from Melbourne to Sydney. It is great to see that progress, but some states still ultra cautious on reopening anything, Claire.
Well, yes, I mean, we always knew we were going to deal with some sort of a second wave. When the entire country went down into, some form of restrictions or lockdown, we knew that although everyone had an optimism bias at that point, that we, hard heads could reckon with that we were probably looking at sort of a second wave. And I think where we're forced to turn our mind here is to, well, some jurisdictions experience something like a third wave. The reality is we're going to be living with this disease for at least a certain number of months and perhaps years ahead in some form or another as we look at the rollout of the vaccine. But without a doubt, those state leaders are looking towards Christmas, thinking, what can I give my community, my people back insofar as movement and lifting of restrictions. And certainly down here in Victoria, Premier Dan Andrews is, I think, very keen to tell Victorians that, masks are only required in a certain number of scenarios and in a certain number of instances now as those states leaders look to how they can start to give people back a little bit of their freedom here and there where reasonably possible.
Mm. Fiona, what are your thoughts on where things are at? I mean, obviously it's a great day today. It's so encouraging to see Victorians being able to travel and fly into Sydney and get back to a bit of normality. We're talking about one of the busiest, normally it's one of the busiest plane routes in the world, so that's getting back. But some of the state leaders, it's, very reticent about doing anything to reopen.
Yeah, you're 100% right there, Kieran. And the map that you had up earlier in the hour, I think you were talking with Andrew Clennell about it, where you're looking at state by state as to, where the active cases are. If you look at that map, then you can see quite clearly that New South Wales doesn't have the most amount of active cases in it, yet states like Queensland are still keeping their borders closed, and overwhelmingly there are more cases being held in hotel quarantine than what are in the general community. Look, there just is no case anymore for these state premiers to leave the borders closed. They are keeping them closed purely for political reasons and politically advantageous to themselves. And that's not good for all Australians. I mean, you look at that. I mean, Queensland has one less active case than New South Wales and Western Australia has 23. Yet those two states still have their borders closed to states like New South Wales and Victoria that have less cases than them. And this is the absurdity of what's going on around our country. And this has to be dealt with. And really, as Australians go into preparing for Christmas, we need to be able to know how people are going to catch up with their family members. I've got family myself in Brisbane, and who's coming for Christmas? We don't know yet. No. But the one thing I will say to all Australians and to all leaders, now that I've belted up the premiers a little bit, is that thank goodness we are in Australia. Could you imagine being in the UK right now with what Boris Johnson's trying to deal with his different chief ministers from Wales and Ireland and those sorts of places? I mean, we really do, it's an awful disease, but it's nowhere compared to where the rest of the world is.
Yeah, exactly. And also the fact that we're into summer too is just encouraging in that sense as well. And Claire, I guess the other thing is that we need to reflect on it as well, is we're lucky we're in Ireland and we've been able to keep those borders manageable, at least, to manage the return of Australians and so on. There's obviously the outbreak in Victoria, but the fact of our geography has also been an assistance overall.
Exactly, and I think, to Fiona's point, although they are low case numbers, we must remember that a lot of these state governments have essentially intel information that suggests that the rate of infection in the community might be much higher than that. There's a series of tests that they do, including testing sewage to see where there might be outbreaks. So those case numbers reflect confirmed cases, and you really do need, the general public to come to the table there and get themselves tested to be able to pick up those cases. And as we know, that there may be more in the community that aren't picked up through those tests. I think the state leaders would be looking at what Steve Marshall's, previous 10 days in office has looked like, and, you know, have a sense of white-knuckled fear about that. I think state leaders now are on notice. They do not want to misstep. They do not want to bungle their response to this disease. It is a, you know, obviously a disease like almost without peer insofar as its infection rates, and needs to be treated very seriously and with great caution in a public policy sense. But look, the challenge for all states from here on in, and it's really one that I know that many treasurers have been, you know, eyeing off just preparing, is their economic rebuild. The public will judge state governments, yes, on their handling of a health crisis. I have argued and believe this to be true, that the public will hold them to a much higher test when it comes to their economic response to this disease, and it's about to get much more challenging for those leaders as they pull together, you know, the biggest and most important budgets insofar as economic stimulus that we have in recent history from a state government perspective. And New South Wales was handed down last week. I think Treasurer, oh dear, he's just skipped my mind. Perrottet, thank you very much, should be commended from a big and brave budget. We've got Treasurer Pallas's budget.
We need more of that to come.
Tomorrow,
and Fiona, yeah, indeed, and we'll be watching that closely. But Fiona, the thing is, when you look at the numbers we're talking about, as Andrew and I discussed earlier, you touched on, there are 13 cases in the community at the moment, outside of South Australia, that is, nationwide. More than 20 million Australians. There's got to be a point where these state leaders say, OK, I'm going to take accountability on this. There needs to be some balance here. Right. Premier McGowan is yet to show any sign that he's cognisant of that need.
Oh, you're 100% right, and this is the thing. I mean, there's places around the world that would dream of the numbers Australia has, and would say that these numbers in some of these state jurisdictions, in a comparison of population, would be a huge raving success. And you're even seeing talks in the UK about bubbles and things with numbers that are eye-watering in comparison to what we've seen here in Australia at all. And to keep the borders closed, it makes no sense. The only thing you can see is that people are doing these purely for a political reason, because they think it's advantageous to do so. Because clearly, in the words of Gladys Berejiklian today, like, where are they getting this advice from? She doesn't know. It just doesn't make sense. And look, I just implore all ministers and or premiers, you know, think about, we are one country, and think about that. And keeping Australians apart, that's not what our federation is. That is not what we are founded on. And at the end of the day, one of the key advantages for Australia going forward, and I hate to put it in this context, is we have the health crisis overwhelmingly under control. Let's go out there and kick some goals with our economy, because right now, by keeping these borders closed, you are putting a massive handbrake on the economy. And you know what? It's the federal budget that continues to get smashed with these things. We spend more dollars as Australians as tourists. Let's open our borders so that New South Wales can spend it in North Queensland and create jobs again. That's what is important. That's so important for mental health and a whole range of other aspects. Let's not just get caught up in stage one. Let's move on to the next phase, which is restarting our country.
Fiona, Claire, thank you very much for that.